The emergency room was already losing control when someone finally said his name, not loudly, almost like they were afraid of the answer. "Where's Dr. Hale?" For half a second, the trauma bay went still. A nurse looked toward the entrance. A resident looked down at the floor, and Officer Ryan Kessler, standing near the glass doors with rain still shining on his uniform, felt the room shift around him before he understood why. Outside, the storm kept tapping against the windows. Inside, monitors screamed over each other. A stretcher rolled past with two paramedics holding pressure against a patient's chest. Another nurse pushed through with blood on her gloves and fear behind her eyes. But the question stayed in the air. Where was Dr. Hale? Then someone answered. He was here earlier. No one moved. The words did not sound like information. They sounded like a warning, because less than an hour before that same ER began begging for him, a quiet black man had walked through those doors in plain clothes, carrying a small medical bag, asking only to get inside. And Officer Kessler had decided he did not belong there. St. Augustine Regional was the kind of hospital that looked tired even when it was clean. The fluorescent lights were too cold. The coffee in the waiting room had probably been sitting there since sunset. Sometime after midnight, the emergency entrance started taking on that strange pressure hospitals get right before something goes wrong. Nurses moved faster without speaking louder. Phones rang longer before anyone answered them. Even the families sitting in the waiting area seemed to sense the night was beginning to turn. Rain slid slowly down the glass doors at the front entrance. That was when Dr. Marcus Hale walked in. No escort. No white coat. No badge hanging around his neck. Just a dark jacket, damp from the rain. A small black medical bag in one hand. And the kind of exhaustion that settles deep into a person instead of showing loudly on their face. Most people never noticed men like him, not because he looked weak, because he did not move like someone trying to be seen. He walked past the waiting room television without looking at it, past a crying child sleeping against her mother's shoulder, past two exhausted paramedics arguing quietly beside a vending machine. The hospital already knew his name, but nobody in that waiting room did. Near the entrance, Officer Ryan Kessler watched him cross the floor. Kessler had been stationed near the ER for 3 nights after a violent incident involving an intoxicated patient the week before. Since then, administration wanted a visible police presence around emergency intake. And Kessler liked visible authority. Tall, broad shoulders, dark patrol jacket zipped to the throat, one hand resting near his vest while he scanned people entering the building the way some men scan for disrespect before danger. He noticed Dr. Hale immediately, not because Marcus caused attention, because he did not. A quiet black man entering the ER after midnight in plain clothes, carrying an unmarked bag, moving calmly through tension without checking in with anyone first. Told Kessler. That calmness did not look professional. It looked suspicious. Marcus slowed briefly near the nurse's station. One of the younger nurses glanced up from a chart and blinked in surprise. "You came in," Marcus gave a small nod. "Heard you were drowning tonight." The nurse let out the kind of tired laugh that only exists inside hospitals. "We lost 2 residents an hour ago." Marcus nodded once more, already looking toward the trauma hallway. No speech, no performance, just someone preparing mentally for another long night. But across the room, Kessler had already started walking toward him, Several people in the waiting room quietly looked up at the same time. Sir. Kessler's voice cut across the nurse's station before Marcus could continue down the hallway. Not loud enough to cause a scene. Not yet. Marcus stopped and turned calmly toward him. Up close. The contrast between the two men became sharper. Kessler carried himself like someone used to controlling movement inside a room. His posture was rigid, alert, already defensive, before any threat appeared. Marcus looked tired. Rain still clung faintly to his jacket collar. There were shadows beneath his eyes that had nothing to do with the weather outside. But what unsettled Kessler most was the absence of urgency in him. Most people reacted when stopped by police inside a hospital. Confusion, apology, nervousness. Marcus simply waited. "You checking in with somebody?" Kessler asked. "I'm heading to trauma." Marcus said it plainly, like the sentence required no explanation. Kessler glanced toward the black medical bag in his hand. "You staff, yes?" The answer came too smoothly for Kessler's liking. "What department?" "Trauma surgery." A silence followed. Not because Marcus sounded uncertain, because he didn't. Kessler studied him again. Plain clothes, no visible ID, no white coat, no badge clipped to his chest. Just a quiet black man standing in the middle of an exhausted ER after midnight. Speaking with the kind of calm confidence Kessler had already decided was an act. "Oh?" Kessler said slowly. "You got credentials on you." Marcus reached calmly toward his jacket pocket. But before he could finish, two EMTs burst through the ambulance entrance with a patient on a stretcher, forcing several nurses to move quickly across the corridor. The younger nurse, who'd greeted Marcus earlier, looked back toward him briefly. Dr. Hale, another voice, interrupted her immediately from deeper inside trauma. "Elena, we need you now." The nurse disappeared into the hallway before she could finish the sentence. Kessler noticed the interruption, but not the name. Marcus lowered his hand slightly, waiting for the chaos to pass. The waiting room had grown quieter. People were pretending not to stare now. A man near the vending machines stopped drinking his coffee halfway to his mouth. A woman holding paperwork shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Nobody liked the feeling developing in the room, because it no longer sounded like security doing its job. It sounded personal. Kessler stepped slightly closer. We've had problems in this ER recently," he said. "People walking in pretending to belong here." Marcus held his gaze. "I understand." The answer should have lowered the temperature. Instead, it made Kessler visibly more irritated. There was something about Marcus's composure that refused to fit the version of him Kessler had already built in his head. No defensiveness, no fear, no attempt to impress him. Just restraint. "You understand," Kessler repeated. "So then, you understand why I need to verify who you are before you start walking around a trauma unit." Marcus nodded once. "That's fine." Still calm, still controlled. And that calmness was becoming the problem, because Kessler was beginning to feel watched. Not by Marcus, by everyone else. The waiting room, the nurses nearby, the security guard pretending not to pay attention from the corner desk. People had started paying attention. And Kessler could feel himself losing authority unless he pushed harder. So he did. "Let me see some ID," he said. Marcus looked at him for a moment, then slowly reached back into his pocket. Marcus pulled a worn leather wallet from inside his jacket. Before he could open it, another burst of movement exploded through the ER doors. A patient somewhere deeper inside trauma began screaming, not from pain, from panic. The sound ripped briefly through the hallway, followed by overlapping voices and the sharp rhythm of shoes against tile. Every nurse within sight turned instinctively toward the commotion. For a moment, the hospital revealed what it really was beneath the paperwork and fluorescent lighting. Pressure. Barely controlled pressure. Marcus glanced once toward the trauma corridor. Not impatiently, automatically, like part of him was already moving in that direction whether his body did or not. Kessler noticed, "Stay right there." Marcus stopped again. The officer stepped closer now. Close enough that several people in the waiting room visibly lowered their eyes. "What exactly are you doing here tonight?" Kessler asked. "I told you," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm here to help trauma." "You scheduled?" "No." Kessler gave a short laugh through his nose. "There it is." The answer seemed to settle something inside him. "So you just decided to walk into an ER in the middle of the night?" Marcus opened the wallet calmly. Inside was his hospital identification. Kessler looked at it only briefly before speaking again. Too briefly, the card no longer mattered. Because by then, the interaction had stopped being about verification. It had become about control. "You understand how this looks?" Kessler asked. Marcus held the ID in his hand without lowering it. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think I do." The waiting area went still. Not dramatics, just uncomfortable, in the way public places become uncomfortable when people realize someone is being treated unfairly, but nobody wants to say it first. Kessler's jaw tightened slightly. Marcus had not raised his voice, had not challenged him, had not refused cooperation, but he also had not surrendered the interaction emotionally. And Kessler no longer knew how to back down without feeling smaller in front of everyone watching. A security guard near the entrance shifted uneasily, but stayed silent. Across the nurses' station, Nurse Elena Torres finally looked fully toward them again. Her expression changed immediately when she saw the ID in Marcus's hand. "Officer," she started carefully. "That's ma'am." "I'm handling it." Torres stopped speaking. Not because she agreed, because another alarm sounded deeper inside the ER. And half the department was already operating on exhaustion. The timing could not have been worse, or more revealing, because nobody stepped in after that. Not the security guard, not the staff nearby, not the administration office behind closed glass upstairs. The hospital saw what was happening and let it continue. Kessler gestured toward the entrance doors. "I need you to leave the building until this gets sorted out." The words landed harder than shouting would have. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Rainwater still glistened faintly across the shoulders of his jacket. The ID remained in his hand. Several people nearby waited for him to argue, to finally say who he was, to force the room to acknowledge him properly. Instead, Marcus slowly placed the ID back into his wallet. No anger crossed his face. That only made the room quieter. "You're making a mistake," Torres said softly. Kessler never looked at her. Marcus picked up his medical bag. Then he turned and walked back toward the same glass doors he had entered less than 10 minutes earlier. The automatic doors opened. Cold rain and ambulance light spilled briefly across the floor, and nobody stopped him from leaving. Outside, Marcus paused beneath the awning for only a second before stepping into the storm. Behind him, the ER doors closed again. 4 minutes later, The first ambulance hit the bay. The second came less than 2 minutes after that. By the time the automatic doors opened for the third stretcher, St. Augustine Regional had stopped functioning like a normal emergency room and started functioning like a pressure chamber. Paramedics pushed through soaked in rainwater and adrenaline. One patient had severe internal bleeding from a highway collision. Another was barely conscious. Someone in trauma was already calling for additional blood before the first scans were complete. Inside the ER, voices became shorter, cleaner. Nobody wasted energy pretending the situation was under control anymore. Officer Kessler remained near the entrance at first, watching the sudden flood of movement with the stiff alertness of someone trying to reassure himself that his presence mattered. But hospitals have a way of shrinking police authority once real medical chaos begins. Doctors stopped noticing him. Nurses moved around him instead of acknowledging him. Even the security guard who had stood quietly beside him earlier disappeared into the background. Now, the room belonged to the people trying to keep strangers alive. Where's Reeves in trauma 2? We need another attending in here now. CT's backed up already. Pressure's dropping. The voices layered over each other without pause. Nurse Eleanor Torres moved quickly between rooms. Gloves already stained dark at the fingertips. She checked a monitor, shouted medication orders toward a resident, then looked instinctively toward the trauma hallway entrance, toward the place Marcus should have been standing. The realization hit her fully for the first time. Not emotionally, operationally. A younger resident nearby looked overwhelmed enough to panic. Who's covering the thoracic case? No one answered immediately. Another nurse looked up. Has anyone called Hale? That question moved through the room differently than the others. Because unlike the shouting, unlike the alarms, unlike the blood and stretchers, that question created silence. Doctor Amanda Reeves emerged from trauma room 2, pulling off one pair of gloves, while another nurse handed her fresh ones immediately. Call him, she said. He's not here. I know he's not here. Call him. Then she stopped moving. Slowly. Her eyes shifted toward the front entrance. Toward Officer Kessler. The room followed a second later. Not dramatically. Just one person after another, beginning to understand the shape of the problem. Kessler frowned slightly. Torres stared at him in disbelief for half a second before answering, "You threw him out?" The words landed harder than the earlier confrontation ever had. Because now they had consequences. Kessler's expression tightened immediately. No. I removed somebody who refused to properly identify himself. Torres looked at him like she no longer had time for the explanation. That was Dr. Marcus Hale. One of the residents looked toward Kessler with open confusion. You threw out Hale. Kessler's posture stiffened defensively. He came in wearing plain clothes, carrying an unmarked bag. He works here. Torres snapped. He wasn't scheduled. Kessler fired back. Because he came in voluntarily. That sentence cut through the room cleanly. Not loud, not emotional, just devastating in its simplicity. Kessler stopped speaking. Around him, the ER kept moving. Patients still needed treatment. Monitors still screamed. But something inside the hospital had shifted permanently. Marcus Hale had not come demanding authority. He had walked into that building offering help, and they had allowed him to be treated like he did not belong there. Dr. Reeves stepped toward the nurse's station and grabbed the phone herself. "Get me Hale," she said quietly. No one argued with her voice this time. The first call went to voicemail. Doctor, Reeves ended it before the automated message finished speaking. Around her, the ER continued operating at the edge of collapse. A resident missed a medication instruction and had to be corrected twice. One trauma patient was being stabilized for surgery, while another was still waiting for imaging that should have happened 10 minutes earlier. The problem was no longer simply staffing. It was leadership. Marcus Hale was the person the department leaned on when pressure stopped feeling manageable, and everyone in that ER suddenly understood how much they had built around his presence without ever saying it out loud. Call him again. Reeves said. Torres already was. Officer Kessler stood near the entrance with his jaw locked tight. Listening to conversations that no longer lowered themselves around him, Hale would have caught that bleed already. Trauma 3 needs another attending now. Where the hell is anesthesia? Did somebody seriously let him walk out? The last question was quieter than the others, which made it harder to ignore. Kessler stepped toward the nurse's station. Look. Nobody told me who he was. Torres looked up from the phone. He told you. Kessler opened his mouth, stopped, because she was right. Marcus had told him exactly who he was. Kessler just decided not to believe him. The realization landed visibly this time. Not as guilt yet. More dangerous than guilt. Humiliation. Because the room was beginning to see the interaction clearly now. Piece by piece, and every version of the story made him look smaller. A hospital administrator finally appeared from the elevator corridor. Tie loosened. Sleeves rolled unevenly from being dragged out of another crisis somewhere upstairs. Paul Whitman scanned the ER quickly. What's happening? Nobody answered immediately. Then Reeves spoke without looking away from the trauma board. We need Hale. Whitman frowned. Then where is he? Another silence. Torres turned slowly toward Officer Kessler. Whitman followed her eyes. The administrator's expression changed almost instantly. Not outrage. Recognition. The kind institutions fear most. Because once a mistake becomes visible to enough witnesses, it stops being private failure and starts becoming liability. Kessler straightened defensively again. He entered through the ER without properly checking in. He's Dr. Marcus Hale, Whitman said carefully. I know that now. The administrator stared at him for a long second. Not angry yet. Just stunned at the scale of the problem unfolding around them. Inside Trauma Room 2. Another alarm began sounding. Reeves pulled off her gloves hard enough to snap one at the wrist. Either somebody gets him back in this building right now, she said, or we start making decisions we are not equipped to make tonight. That sentence changed the emotional gravity of the room completely. Because now the consequences had become human, not administrative, not professional, human. Kessler looked toward the rain-covered entrance doors. For the first time since the confrontation started, uncertainty finally appeared on his face. Not because he feared punishment, because he was beginning to understand what Marcus Hale actually was inside that hospital. Not a visitor, not a volunteer, a stabilizing force. The person people looked for when things stopped feeling survivable. Torres lowered the phone slowly from her ear. He's not answering. No one spoke after that. The ER kept moving. But now, every minute Marcus stayed gone felt expensive. Then, quietly, Whitman looked toward Kessler and asked the question nobody in the room wanted to hear. Exactly what did you say to him before he left? The call came back 11 minutes later. Not to administration. Not to Officer Kessler, to Elena Torres. She answered immediately. Marcus. The noise of the ER swallowed half her voice. For a moment, she covered one ear just to hear him properly. Nobody nearby pretended not to listen anymore. Torres swallowed once before speaking again. We need you back. No performance. No polished explanation. Just the truth. Across the room, Dr. Reeves stood over a trauma chart, waiting for the answer without looking up. Whitman remained motionless beside the nurse's station. And Officer Kessler stared at the floor tiles near the entrance like they had suddenly become more stable than the room around him. Torres listened quietly for several seconds. Then her expression changed. Not relief. Something heavier. Understanding. You have every right to be angry, she said softly. I know. The ER around her continued moving in sharp fragments. Someone called for another unit of blood. A patient began crashing in trauma too. Metal instruments clattered onto a tray somewhere down the hallway. But inside the small space surrounding that phone call, the hospital felt strangely still. Torres nodded slowly. Yes. Another pause. Then finally, okay. She lowered the phone. Reeves looked up first. Well, Torres exhaled carefully. He's coming. No one celebrated. The room was too exhausted for that. Too aware of why the sentence mattered. But the shift was immediate. Residents moved faster. A nurse who had looked close to panic 30 seconds earlier visibly steadied herself. Even Reeves' posture changed slightly, like someone finally handing weight back to a structure already starting to fail. Only Kessler remained disconnected from the relief moving quietly through the department, because now the room no longer belonged to his version of events. 5 minutes later, the ER doors opened again. Rain blew briefly through the entrance before the automatic seal closed behind him. Marcus Hale stepped back into the hospital carrying the same black medical bag, same dark jacket, same exhausted face. But nothing else about the room was the same. Nobody stopped him. Nobody questioned him. A resident immediately moved aside without being asked. Another nurse crossed the hallway toward him with a chart already in hand. Male. 38. She said quickly. Possible thoracic bleed. Unstable pressure. Marcus listened while walking. Focused instantly. No speech about what happened earlier. No visible anger. No attempt to embarrass anyone. And that restraint became unbearable for Officer Kessler to watch because the hospital's reaction to Marcus exposed the truth more brutally than any argument could have. This was not a man pretending to belong there. This was the person the ER trusted when everything else started breaking apart. Marcus reached the trauma hallway, paused briefly at the scrub sink, and began washing his hands. The movement was calm. Automatics. The kind repetition built from years of carrying responsibility without room for hesitation. Behind him, the entire department reorganized itself around his arrival almost instinctively. Kessler watched nurses defer to him immediately, watched Reeves hand over the thoracic case without explanation, watched residents straighten the second Marcus entered the room. Nobody questioned him this time. Marcus pulled on surgical gloves while Reeves spoke quickly beside him. He lost pressure twice. We stabilized for now. But I know, Marcus said quietly. Then he entered trauma, room 2. The doors swung shut behind him. For the first time all night. The panic inside the ER eased by the time the sun began rising behind St. Augustin Regional. The storm had finally moved on. The emergency room looked different after nights like that. Quieter, not peaceful, just emptied out. Exhausted nurses leaned against counters finishing paperwork with trembling hands. Residents moved through the hallways slower now, carrying the emotional weight that always comes after survival finally replaces panic. Inside Trauma Room 2, the patient Marcus Hale fought to stabilize was still alive. Somewhere between midnight and sunrise, the entire hospital had quietly rearranged itself around a truth most of them should have recognized much earlier. Respect is easy when a title is visible, when the white coat is clean, when authority is announced before a person speaks. But dignity becomes much more revealing when none of those things are present. Officer Ryan Kessler remained near the ER entrance, long after his shift should have ended. But he still hadn't left. A formal review had already started before sunrise. Security footage, witness statements, questions administration could no longer avoid asking, not only about Kessler, about everyone who watched, everyone who hesitated, everyone who allowed a man to be treated like he did not belong inside, the very place depending on him to survive the night. Marcus finished washing his hands in silence outside recovery. The exhaustion on his face looked heavier now. Just human. Kessler saw him preparing to leave and finally stepped forward. For a second, it looked like he wanted to say something rehearsed, something safe enough to reduce the damage down to a misunderstanding. But even he seemed to realize how small those words would sound. "I didn't know," he said quietly. Marcus looked at him for a long moment, then finally answered, "You did know enough." Nothing in Kessler's posture survived that sentence, because the truth was sitting there plainly between them now. Marcus Hale had identified himself. He had stayed calm. He had cooperated. He had arrived only to help. And none of it had mattered once someone decided he looked like the wrong man in the wrong place. Marcus picked up his bag and walked toward the same glass doors where he had been forced out only hours earlier. This time, nobody blocked his path. The staff near the nurse's station looked up as he passed. Not dramatically, just differently. The way people look at someone after realizing too late how much weight they had been carrying quietly for everyone else. Outside, the pavement still reflected the fading ambulance lights from the night before, and behind those hospital doors, the memory of what happened to Dr. Marcus Hale was going to stay there far longer than the storm ever did.